Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. This week I wanted to do a solo episode where I explore two of what people often call the most powerful psychedelics, which is 5-MeO-DMT and NN-DMT, which is often just abbreviated to DMT. So these are two chemically related compounds, as you might be able to guess from the names, but there's a lot of kind of misinformation out there and confusion because what is often referred to as DMT, the chemical name being NN-DMT, because 5-MeO-DMT also has DMT at the end of the name. Sometimes people will use DMT to refer to both, which is not the conventional way to do it and can lead to accidents, basically, because 5-MeO-DMT is vastly more powerful by dose, so you need to be taking a fraction of what you take with DMT. So this is something, just to get on my soapbox at the start, this is something we really need to be calling out in the psychedelic community and making sure people are consistent with their naming and are not referring to 5-MeO-DMT as DMT. If you go to Psychonaut Wiki, which is a kind of Wikipedia type website related to psychedelics, they have a disclaimer at the top of their 5-MeO-DMT and DMT pages making this point. So if you need any clarification, you can read about them there. But so they're chemically similar. The dimethyltryptamine part of the name is the kind of basic structure around which the chemical is built. So that's why there's this commonality. There are names for other psychedelics like psilocybin you could also describe as a form of a DMT. So these are tryptamines, and the interesting things with 5-MeO-DMT and NN-DMT, which from now on I'll just call DMT, is that their dynamics are very similar. So what I mean by that is a typical session will last maybe 5 to 10 minutes, 20 minutes at most, and with a sufficient dose, there's this rapid onset followed by a kind of complete disconnect from the experience of everyday reality, and then a return to normality in this very, very quick period of time. But the content is completely different. DMT is very kind of interactive. It feels like you remain intact typically, and you encounter entities and other spaces. It feels like you go to other dimensions, is often the word people use. Whereas 5-MeO-DMT is a far more kind of inward meditative state of absorption where there's very little content, very little hallucination or visuals going on, but there's a kind of profound perspective shift. So a while ago I was kind of systematically exploring these two, and with 5-MeO-DMT I'd been kind of dabbling around at low doses for a while and had been hesitant to do a full dose session, and I'll explain why that is. So the classic experience with 5-MeO-DMT is a kind of unitive mystical experience, state of ego dissolution, where your usual sense of self is kind of left behind or dissolves, and it's replaced by this state of kind of perfect awareness, this kind of enlightened state where everything feels perfect and there are no problems with existence. It's all just kind of unfolding the way it's supposed to, and you are part of it. You are the same thing as everything else, so there's this kind of unitive aspect. And this is very similar to the kind of mystical experience I'd had when I was younger and the kind of states that I routinely experienced with meditation. So it's interesting that there was this hesitancy to dive in with this kind of chemically mediated route to what seemed like the same state. And the interesting subtle difference between those two states that led to me having some trepidation is that my initial spontaneous mystical experience as a teenager came about through stress, and it had this kind of whilst the insights were valid and it was a genuine cutting through of suffering in this kind of Buddhist, non-attached way, it came from a place of trauma and of escapism and of almost dissociation. So the suffering was still there, but it wasn't interpreted as suffering. There could still be pain. It's like the monks who set themselves on fire in protest. There's still pain there, or there's still what you could say in neuroscience would be nociception, the detection of damage by the nerves, but there's not suffering because the interpretation of it as negative has been suspended. So it was that kind of, had that kind of character to it. Then through my psychedelic work, I discovered the layers of trauma that many of us carry, and worked through those, and then my engagement with these mystical states became embodied, became far more kind of intimate, where instead of escaping from suffering, it was it felt like a kind of a going inwards, going towards everything and feeling okay with everything, because there was this kind of healing process going on. And so I think it's interesting that the kind of ordinary consciousness to me feels like a kind of quite a precarious plateau that we build. And I mean, imagine it's like a sloped plateau. You could, if you wonder what's beneath it, what kind of states of consciousness are there when you let go of your ordinary way of conceptualizing the world, one thing to do would be to move carefully down the slope and kind of drop off the end, which would be like meditation and psychotherapeutic work to undo any traumatic experiences, and this kind of the thing I did second. But it turns out that if you fall off the other end, you're running up the slope in fear, and then you fall off in this analogy, you land in the same space. It's the same psychological space of just consciousness just kind of illuminating itself in this naturally perfected state. You don't have to create the state, it's already there. So if you knock out the rational mind with psychedelics or stress or whatever, you can access this same kind of state. So having fallen off the other end, I had spent years cultivating the ability to access the same states through this healthier, more integrated route that has the benefit of this kind of healing that goes along with it and reduction in suffering. And so it seemed to me that the 5-MeO-DMT experience was going to so rapidly put me into this state of kind of acceptance that my concern was of a kind of embodied reactions to it. So what I mean by that is, for me, the kind of healing process was one of learning to feel my emotions in my body, instead of having this kind of split between the mind and the body. And as you do that, you learn that there are these layers and layers of tension and fearful kind of behavioral patterns that you've been struggling with. And then when people have a kind of 5-MeO-DMT experience, if they've not done that processing work, if there's still part of them that is fearful, they can have any number of strange physical responses, people gasping and making weird noises and thrashing around. And in the experience, people in these states are usually in this kind of enlightened mind where they're not identified with the ego, but the body, the kind of the embodied organism that is a survival machine isn't ready for it, and so it's trying to work in the context of this kind of perfect acceptance. It's trying to release and work out all of the issues that it's not worked out before. So this can seem a bit weird if the idea of things being trapped in the body in this way. But if you imagine someone who, what would be a good example? If someone was drowning and they needed to try to gasp for air, and then you save them, but you didn't allow them to, say you could kind of just kind of shut down their response to that in their brain, and they didn't get a chance to really to kind of gasp and feel that they're actually safe, to inflate their lungs and have their brain register, okay, I'm breathing now, this is okay, which would be to enter the fear state, then come back to feeling safe. If you interrupt that process, then the models in their brain have not completed that loop, so there's still fear, and that person presumably would be carrying tension, and would, if you then stopped those the circuits in the brain that allow them to go about their day holding on to that tension, then you would, because of this kind of state of acceptance, you would allow them to engage in that behavior to try to complete that circle. So they would instinctively start gasping. So that's trying to map this complex thing of physical embodied emotional responses to stressful events through to a simple kind of example there. So this was my concern, that in a state of complete acceptance, that there would be some potentially dangerous, physical reactions. And so I think, people have to be extremely careful with this substance. So then something I did that I'm very glad I did was build up by dose. It started at low doses and gradually increase, which in the past wasn't the way I used to do things. I used to dive in at the deep end, and if you do that with psychedelics enough, you'll make a mistake once where you dive in too quickly, and then you'll learn your lesson. So I advise wisely not taking that route and being careful from the start. So I was kind of increasing, and then when it came the time to do the full experience, immediately there was just a sense of, why was I ever worried about this? Not in a way where I was wrong, because I realized in that moment that I'd done enough embodied healing work that my body was ready to accept this and not struggle with it. And so as this kind of rush is coming over you, I found I immediately was just in a mental state. I was probably even saying the word in my head, of just saying yes, 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 just so that I was purely kind of aligned with it. There was no part of me that was struggling with it, because it's so intense. Even intense pleasure, there can be a part of you that's like, whoa, okay, not today, can I delay this? And I think that's when people can have bad experiences, if they don't just go in with that pure mindset of acceptance and saying yes. And so it was a beautiful kind of positive experience, immediately catapulted into this state over the course of seconds, just complete acceptance and this kind of wordless peace that's very intense. And in that state I did feel kind of deep relaxation in my muscles, where there were points where my legs, they might have wanted to do something to kind of kick out or something, because it was just this wonderfully positive feeling washing over my body of it just fully dropping any burdens and being fully relaxed, which can be quite intense, the kind of pleasure you can feel there, and your body can instinctively want to kind of escape from it, which sounds funny, that we do have an upper limit. Gay Hendricks talks about this, we have an upper limit of how good we're willing to feel. So then in the state itself, it just felt like, it feels like being the Buddha, or like an enlightened being, and in that kind of wordless state where you just feel everything to be perfect. I remember reflecting as I was coming out of it on this kind of podcast and YouTube channel, and talking in public about this material, and the first thought I had, which is a kind of classic thought from that state, is one of anything like this, any talking, doing anything, trying to go anywhere, is some neurotic behavior. It's a strange aberration that we do because we can't just be at peace, and we can't just be in this kind of enlightened state. So that was the first thought, but then the next thought was one that was very much of feeling good about the work that I'm trying to do here, because it's very much aimed at honestly providing intellectual containers for these experiences, so that the podcast isn't claiming to be the experience itself, but it should always be understood to be secondary to the actual experiences we have. So, for a long time I've wanted to balance all, there's so much talking that goes on in content like this. I do want to balance it with experiential practice, because otherwise you can just listen to conversations and think you're getting the real thing, but the real thing is always the experience. So I will be doing some kind of guided meditation related stuff in future. I've been threatening to for a while now, so we'll get around to that over the next year probably. But yeah, so it was this wonderful state, and the visions are very subtle, just some kind of geometry, and then I remember in the middle of it there was very kind of rounded, almost egg shapes, reminded me of the kind of lotus petals you see in kind of Buddhist paintings, and it made me reflect on in these states, it feels like you're coming into contact with kind of base reality. A lot of people come away feeling they've seen the kind of source of the universe. That consciousness is the kind of source of the universe. That's not what I came away with, but you do get this feeling of feeling like you're in touch with the absolute kind of rock bottom of something. I think that's the rock bottom of our minds rather than of the universe. But yeah, so from this state, after I was coming out of it, I was reflecting on the ways in which these states are simultaneously provide real insight, but also they are the product of a fallible mind, in my opinion. So take these kind of curvy, like egg shapes and petals. One of the most basic things our perceptual systems do in kind of vision is extract what we might call statistical structure. And so that's kind of patterns of correlations and in the data that's coming in with our eyes. So curves have a certain structure, spiky edges have another structure. And something I've noticed with psychedelics is there seems to be a spectrum from feeling when you feel, so I'll talk about myself. When I feel relaxed and at peace, everything kind of visuals take on this rounded, gentle structure. If I feel on edge, things become kind of spiky. So I was going for a walk one day during an LSD session, and I noticed that as I would breathe in and out, these things my kind of visual experience would change. So as you breathe in, you actually get this kind of neuromodulatory difference between the in-breath and the out-breath, and it seems that the out-breath is one that's more conducive to relaxation, and the in-breath to kind of activation, which makes sense because when you're anxious or fearful, you kind of tighten up and breathe in, and you might freeze, but when you're relaxed, you can kind of breathe out in a long, slow way. So what was happening is I was looking at the same bit of ground, but I would breathe in and it would almost become like rat's teeth and spider's legs, and there would be this fear feeling, and then I would breathe out and it would all kind of soften to kind of curves. It made me think of this experiment in psychology where to do with synesthesia, the kind of experience of people who can taste words, for example, or see musical notes as colours, where you get this kind of cross-sensory modality effect. And we all have this to some extent where our sensory modalities are actually not completely separate. So this experiment, they had a kind of a cloud shape and a spiky kind of star shape. And they said to participants, one of these is called Kiki and the other one's called Boobar. Which is which, and you can maybe take a moment to think for yourself, which here is Boobar, the cloud or the spiky thing, and it's Kiki, the other one. And the majority of people say that the cloud is Boobar and the spiky one is Kiki. And this makes sense because I was talking about statistical structure, and things that have sharp edges are going to vibrate at frequencies where they produce kind of higher pitch frequencies, which are the kinds of sounds you hear in Kiki, whereas Boobar, something kind of gelatinous and bulbous that's going to kind of bounce at a slow rate, is going to produce these kinds of these sounds that have that kind of corresponding effect. So our brains pick up on this structure, and so when you're seeing something rounded, you can actually anticipate that it's more likely to have a kind of certain frequencies of sound associated with it. So in this state where I'm seeing what feels like the kind of images that people have captured in Buddhist paintings for hundreds of years, it feels like because you're in this positive, safe, accepting state, you're seeing the statistical structure that goes with safety versus sharp, you're not seeing sharp, pointy, threatening edges that could hurt you. So that to me reminds me that you can't just take everything at face value. It's not that you're actually seeing a dimension or a realm that's full of flowers and Buddhas and eggs and whatever it is. But the core idea of seeing from this perspective where you can just accept everything, that's entirely valid. So it was a very positive experience, and I think going into it, I'd assumed that perhaps 5-MeO-DMT might be a kind of a good sacrament for people who are, if we see psychedelic churches that aim to kind of re-engage with kind of ritual use of sacraments, I thought perhaps that could be a good good one because it lasts 10 minutes and produces this very kind of pure positive state. But what it kind of made me feel is that I really feel there's no way around the embodied therapeutic effect of psychedelics. They really cause you to confront things in yourself in light of the experience. So they don't cause you, in my experience, to kind of dissociate into a spiritual experience. It's very, imminent and embodied. So it made me feel that I actually don't see psychedelics being used weekly, or perhaps in kind of religious ceremonies going forward, but instead that people will presumably engage with these substances in a healing way, have spiritual experiences, but then perhaps through symbolic, sacraments, much like we already have in churches, people can be reminded of what those states mean to them, or through other activities like communal singing and meditation, we can cultivate these states. So then the other experiments I was doing alongside this was with NN-DMT, and it's such a different experience. You have this a similar kind of intense lift-off, and then in these experiences I didn't get to the point of having, I think, what you'd call a full breakthrough experience. I had all of them were very intense, and I completely lost contact with everyday reality. But what would happen is there would be this kind of intensity building and a kind of high-pitched sound increasing in intensity. And I would find myself transitioning into rooms, three-dimensional rooms like any you've seen before, where there were these kinds of entities that were humanoid, that would be kind of dancing around at me, and preparing me for the next phase, which, if I'd taken a large enough dose, would have been an experience I had in the past, which was to kind of be effectively shot through into another space that was just utter kind of bewildering, constantly changing in your face, manic experience that was incredibly overwhelming when I first did it years ago. But these experiences, I was doing the same thing of increasing the dose, because the first time I did way too much, and it was very I found it very unsettling, because imagine if you'd never had a dream in your life, and you were in a culture that didn't really that suppressed dreaming as a phenomenon, but there's a small group of people underground who are into dreaming and they know how to do it, and so you do it one day, and suddenly you're living in another world for a period of time at night, where you're interacting with people. Like, it's hard to imagine how mind-blowing that would be, and how you'd come back and think, well, like, what is this? Like, it would really turn your world upside down, I think. So it's very similar with DMT, I think. You have this thing that produces something very similar to a dream state, that feels utterly immersive and real, but you were awake 10 seconds ago before it happened, and you still feel like yourself. It's not like falling asleep, where you feel that there's some kind of transition has happened where you've become drowsy, but this, you're still wide awake. So it's a similar kind of experience. I found it very unsettling. It showed me how attached I was to my worldview in a way I think a lot of scientists are, that I wasn't aware of, and so that was really helpful. But it was a painful process of realizing that if it turned out the world was different, I would find that at the time I would have found that quite destabilizing. Although perhaps we all would find having a worldview challenged in that way destabilizing. Anyway, so I wanted to approach it again, but building up. And the experiences got kind of more intense, more immersive. Well, they were pretty immersive from the start. And every single time it feels utterly real, and it was utterly bizarre. But much like that in the analogy of if dreaming was suppressed and you started experimenting with dreaming, I think gradually over time you would realize, the first dream you have, you might be like, wow, like I need to go talk to I spoke to my cousin in my dream, and I felt so real. It must be that, if I go talk to them, I bet they'll confirm that it's happened in some strange way. But gradually over time you would realize that this is something being generated by your mind. Similar thing kind of happens, I think, when you dabble with DMT for a while. And for me, a key moment was I'd just come back from staying in hotels and driving around to them. And one of the scenes I saw was, it could have been me, but it was a kind of male seen from behind walking to a car just coming out of a hotel. And in the experience, it feels like you're seeing the code that builds reality. And so you're seeing kind of frames of like, as if the DMT world had built that scene. And as weird as that sounds, if that makes any sense. But then when you come down, you feel, well, that feels very much like what happens in a dream, where the brain just throws up stuff that's happened, and weaves it into it. So I was increasing a dose, and then I got to a point where I took a dose that I thought should have been enough to have the breakthrough experience, but it didn't. Didn't have that effect. And so I thought about taking a bit more, but I found that at the start of these experiments, I felt very excited and I was really fascinated by this world. By that point, I felt this kind of bit despondent, a kind of sadness around it. And it's hard to, I haven't fully pinned down why that is, but I think it might be the same thing of being unsettled by how weird it is. And that even though I think it can be fit into our current framework, it really challenges it. It really does. It's just very odd. So I think perhaps part of me was just feeling like it wasn't the right time for me. I should give it a break for a while and maybe return to it at some point. So I didn't end up going for the full experience after the failed attempt, and I'm glad that in the past I would have pushed myself kind of out of a lack of self-care to kind of jump in at the deep end. But I'm glad now that, I approach these things with a sense of there's all the time in the world to explore and to do it responsibly and safely, which is what I've been doing. And yeah, I would definitely, I think it's a wonderful way to approach these things. So I hope that's been interesting, and until next time.